In late October of 1982, 69-year-old Marvin Brandlin was living with his wife Ethel in the leafy green suburbs of Fort Dodge, Iowa. Their neighborhood they called home was a quiet, tranquil place. But every Halloween, the streets came alive with veritable legions of trick-or-treaters. Marvin and Ethel delighted at the display of colorful and creative costumes, and happily handed out candy to any children who darkened their door. That year, Halloween fell on a Sunday, so in order to avoid any sugar-induced hyperactivity on what amounted to a school night, the vast majority of trick-or-treating took place on Saturday the 30th. By around 9 p.m., the steady stream of visitors had started to peter out, and the Brandlins believed that the rest of their evening would be relatively undisturbed. Yet around 10 p.m., they received the last knock on their door. Marvin shuffled towards the door, half expecting to see one last group of trick-or-treaters outside. But when he opened up, he immediately knew something was horribly wrong. Standing on the doorstep was a man who appeared to be wearing a pillowcase on his head. Gazing out of two roughly cut holes were eyes that regarded him with a cold, calculated hatred. And when he saw the gun in the masked man's hand, Marvin realized this was no trick-or-treater. The masked man raised his pistol, pointed it squarely at Marvin's head, then told him to back away from the door. Marvin simply raised his hands and did as the man asked. Assuming he was some kind of robber, Marvin told the man that he was welcome to take anything he wanted, but there was very little things of value inside the home. According to Ethel Brandlin, this was when the masked man told her husband something to the effect of,
"I know about the safe, Marvin."
To Marvin's knowledge, only he and his wife knew about the safe he kept hidden inside his home office, and realizing that the masked man knew of its existence must have been nothing short of horrifying. You see, Marvin Brandlin had a very little confidence in the centralized banking system and chose to keep the majority of his life savings much closer to hand. This meant that the safe contained upwards of $40,000, with a further $5,000 worth of gold bullion, and naturally, the Brandlins tried their utmost to keep the safe a closely guarded secret. There was no time to wonder how the man in the mask had come to learn of Brandlin's safe, because if he managed to empty it, the financial repercussions would be nothing short of catastrophic. With that in mind, Marvin suddenly lunged for the masked man's pistol, making one desperate attempt to save his fortune. But the man was fast, too fast for Marvin. In a split second, he sent a bullet ripping through Marvin's neck. Realizing that the robbery had gone horribly wrong, the masked man quickly fled the Brandlins' home, pulling his mask off during his escape route before tossing it over a garden fence. A devastated Ethel Brandlin quickly called 911, but despite Marvin being rushed to a hospital in Des Moines, he passed away during emergency surgery in the early hours of October 31st. With Ethel Brandlin unable to give the police an adequate physical description of the suspect, homicide detectives had no idea who the killer might be. The only real clue they had pertained to the killer's knowledge of the Brandlin's safe, meaning that there was an extremely high probability that the suspect was either a member of their extended social circle or even one of the Brandlins' younger relatives. The couple's granddaughter, Tessa Trueblood, remembers hearing the news of Marvin's murder. "You go numb," she told the local media outlet. "I had to take my grandmother back to the house to get medicines. You walk in and you're just in disbelief that it's happening till you see the blood. And then you know it's real." As the months passed and the police failed to identify a suspect, Ethel Brandlin became increasingly depressed and despondent. Her heartbreak peaked during Thanksgiving dinner, and after suffering what amounted to a nervous breakdown, she died a few months later. She just quit eating and broke down. Then she cried and cried and cried, Ethel's daughter recalled. "And you know, I'll never forget when they carried her out in her chair. We always say she died of a broken heart because she didn't want to be by herself." As of 2010, the case was reopened in hopes of gaining DNA evidence from the discarded pillowcase mask. But sadly, forensic analysts were unable to do so. Yet perhaps the most terrifying thing about this particular case is that the Brandlin family and their extended relatives seem to know exactly who the killer is. The only thing keeping them from the justice they deserve is the fact that there simply isn't enough corroborating evidence. For the longest time, we didn't pursue anything because we knew in our stomach, in our gut, who it was. said Teresa Trueblood. But there was fear, and my grandma always lived in fear. To this day, not a single suspect has been officially named in relation to Marvin Brandlin's murder, and his killer continues to hide in plain sight. So this Halloween, take caution in who you open your doors to, because hiding among the throngs of innocent trick-or-treaters could be some very dangerous people. On Halloween morning of 1981, while the dawn sun rose over the St. Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas, 76-year-old Sister Tadia Benz was sound asleep in her small, sparsely decorated bedroom. On any average morning, Sister Tadia would wake up at 5 a.m. sharp. Then she'd walk down to the on-site chapel to attend morning prayers. But on the morning of October 31st, one of Sister Tadia's closest confidants noticed her absence with concern. "I was concerned because she seldom missed chapel," Sister Angela Martinez later said. So following the conclusion of morning prayers, a handful of nuns walked over to Sister Tadia's bedroom in order to check up on her. When they arrived, they found that the door to her room was closed. This was extremely unusual, as Sister Tadia was hard of hearing and usually kept her door ajar to hear the morning buzzer. But upon opening the door, her fellow nuns were completely unprepared for what they would find. Sister Tadia was lying naked on the cold stone floor, arms outstretched by her sides, with a pool of blood surrounding her uncovered head. One of the nuns hurried to render her first aid, but it was too late. Sister Tadia was dead. At first glance, it appeared that her fatal head trauma was the result of an accidental fall. And to preserve her dignity, her fellow nuns wrapped her naked body in a bedsheet, then placed it back on her bed. As the word of sudden passing rippled through the convent, a devastated young nun named Sister Florentine stopped by Tadia's bedroom in order to pay her last respects. But while sitting near the body, Florentine spotted something that sent a chill down her spine. One of Tadia's bedroom windows was ajar, and the pane of glass it contained was broken. Sister Florentine realized that someone had broken into the room, and if that was the case, her death might have not been an accidental as they initially suspected. After receiving word from a 911 call from the convent, 2 responding police officers performed a preliminary examination of Sister Tadia's body. And it was then the first signs of homicide were discovered. She had severe bruising around her neck, and coupled with the evidence of a break-in, this led the officers to surmise that she had indeed been murdered. Yet following an examination at the local coroner's office, local law enforcement learned that not only had Sister Tadia been beaten and strangled by some unknown assailant, she'd been sexually assaulted too. After analyzing a series of fingerprints taken from her bedroom, law enforcement discovered that they belonged to 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett. At his murder trial, Garrett denied all charges, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Pubic hairs taken from the crime scene were discovered to be an exact match for Garrett's, and a steak knife found under Sister Tadia's bed was found to match the set of knives in Garrett's home kitchen. Garrett admitted to sneaking into the convent on the night of the murder, but said his intention was merely to rob the place. He had entered the convent not through Tadia's bedroom window, but by the front door, and his route took him from the medication room to the cafeteria, which is where he claimed to have picked up the knife. Garrett then claimed to have crept into several of the nuns' bedrooms, including Tadia's, and explained the presence of his fingerprints by claiming he'd leaned on a headboard while trying to reach a valuable-looking crucifix which was mounted on the wall. Following its retrieval, Garrett claimed he'd promptly fled the convent and was back at his parents' house around 10 p.m. However, one of the nuns stated that he couldn't have entered the convent through its front door, since it was only unlocked for scheduled visitors. Another nun was said to vehemently refute Garrett's claim that he stole an expensive-looking crucifix, as Tadia had taken a vow of poverty and eschewed luxurious material possessions. During Garrett's trial, the prosecuting attorney called a psychologist to the stand, one who'd interviewed Garrett while on remand. This psychologist was of the opinion that Garrett was severely mentally impaired, describing him as chronically psychotic, and added that he'd had one of the most virulent histories of abuse and neglect I've encountered in 28 years of practice. The court heard that when Garrett was just a boy, he had been the victim of horrific molestations at the hands of his stepfather. The same stepfather then loaned Garrett out to other child abusers for the right price, all while plying with the young boy with drugs and alcohol in order to keep him quiet. While extremely tragic, Garrett's past was used to paint him as a violent and unstable young man, and coupled with the mountain of physical evidence, the jury saw fit to convict him of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death in September of 1982. Garrett spent the next 10 years on death row, until finally the date of his execution was set for January 6th of 1992. Yet just days before he was due to face lethal injection, there was an attempt at an intervention from the most unlikeliest of places. The head of the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II himself, contacted the Texas Board of Appeals with an appeal for clemency. Not only did he strongly object to the death penalty, but the Pope also argued that there was a considerable amount of new information coming to light, some of which indicated that Garrett was innocent of the crime he was accused of. The governor of Texas eventually relented and held a meeting to decide on whether or not Garrett's death sentence should be overturned. 17 board members held a simple vote, but not a single one of them wished to commute Garrett's sentence. And as a result, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed on February 11th of 1992, at age just 28. The violation of murder of a nun is perhaps one of the most viscerally disturbing crimes imaginable, and it's understandable that the police would want to close that case quickly to avoid a morale panic. But in their haste to do so, could they have condemned an innocent young man to death? 12 years following his death, Amarillo-based attorney Jesse Quackenbush took it upon himself to prove Garrett's innocence. He told one media outlet that the newly discovered evidence of Johnny Frank Garrett's innocence is so compelling it will cause even the most bloodthirsty proponents of the death penalty to shake their heads in doubt. He followed up with a letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, informing them that there were numerous similarities between Sister Tadea's slaying and that of a 77-year-old Narnie Box Bryson, who was killed just 3 months before Sister Tadea in the exact same part of town. The man convicted of Bryson's murder, Leoncio Perez Rueda, was incarcerated at the time of Quackenbush's investigation. But due to lack of resources, law enforcement was unable to formally reopen the case. But even if the killer really did turn out to be Rueda, and a few years were tacked onto his already lengthy sentence, the finality of the death sentence means wrongly convicted innocents will never get the redemptive justice they deserve. With an elderly Rueda approaching his own earthly exit, it's fast becoming too late to talk to anyone who actually knows how Sister Tadea Benz lost her life. Perhaps we'll never truly know the identity of her killer, but one thing we can be certain of is that a man capable of murdering and violating a nun in her mid-70s is nothing shy of a complete monster. Born on August 9th of 1990, Teresa Lynn Venegas lived in Dickinson, Texas with her large and loving family. Teresa was very close with her 2 older sisters, but she had a particularly special relationship with their grandmother, whose home, a place of sanctuary, when Teresa's home life grew too hectic. She was a good student and led a very active social life, so it wasn't unusual for her to return home fairly late, even on a school night. And on Halloween of 2006, this was no different. Teresa told her parents that she planned to attend a costume party with some high school friends, but the story was merely a ruse. In reality, she planned to meet up with a 19-year-old love interest from Abilene, who was driving down to see her. We can assume that Teresa was excited at the prospect of meeting the young man in the flesh, as they'd been talking online for quite a while by that point. Yet little did she know, that night was to be the last of her entire life. A few days later, Teresa's body was found by a dirt bike rider. She was lying in a shallow grave just a few hundred meters away from her high school. When local homicide detectives began investigating her murder, their first port of call was to read over her cell phone records. Teresa had apparently called her date at around 10 p.m., and an accompanying text message revealed that she was having trouble locating their proposed meeting place. This obviously made him the prime suspect for her murder, but a forensic examination discovered that he was innocent of the crime. Not a single trace of his DNA could be found on Teresa's body. Law enforcement managed to place her at a party on California Avenue at around 11 p.m., but it seems Teresa visited another party on Dickinson's Bramble Lane, where she was spotted shortly after midnight in the company of a man described looking older than her. It's not clear who this man is, but we know for a fact that he was one of the last people to see Teresa alive. And law enforcement's failure to apprehend him is symptomatic of the case's frustrations and failures. Despite not releasing many details about Teresa's death, the police made it clear that foul play was suspected. It later emerged that she had been badly beaten and received a cloaked casket funeral due to the water damage her body had endured after being dumped in a drainage ditch. Others said that Teresa's body had some of the worst ligature marks they'd ever seen, and that when her body was found, a belt was still tied around her neck. It was also discovered that Teresa's hair had been cut off, which possibly indicated some sort of personal motive, or at least the killer was disturbed enough to make it some kind of trophy. After local law enforcement appealed for eyewitnesses, several people reported seeing a Caucasian man with long dark hair acting suspiciously near the high school on the night of Halloween. A volunteer search party also found a pair of glasses and a hair clip not too far from the drainage ditch, both items belonging to Teresa, indicating that she had resisted her attacker before she was finally overcome. DNA belonging to the killer was recovered from Teresa's body, but almost exactly 15 years later, it has still not been used to identify a suspect. It also should be noted that more than 45 people have been interviewed in relation to the case, but not a single person has been officially charged with Teresa's murder. On November 1st of 2016, almost 10 years exactly after her murder, the Dickinson Police Department released a statement pertaining to Teresa's death. There have been significant developments during the last 10 years, the Post read, but investigators are still looking for additional information to help give Teresa's family closure. The use of the word significant developments is curious indeed, but it wasn't all that clear what these developments consisted of. However, some have suggested that the case has been linked to a series of other murders that have taken place in what are ominously referred to as the Texas killing fields. Just 9 months after Teresa was murdered, the body of Bridget Guerin was discovered on Crystal Beach. Crystal Beach is only an hour and a half driving time from Dickinson, Texas, and is easily accessible through the Galveston area. On top of that, the crime scene was eerily similar to Teresa's. Bridget was beaten, strangled, and indecently assaulted, and found half dead and half naked near a body of water. Despite there being no official law enforcement connections made between the two murders, it is plausible that the similarities in the murder mean that they were committed by the same person, given the relatively close time frame and the geological proximity to the so-called killing fields. The Texas killing fields consist of a 50-mile stretch off Interstate 45, which runs between the cities of Houston and Galveston. The place has become infamous following discovery of 4 corpses near the Calder oil fields, which are just 6 miles away from where Teresa's body was found. Since the 1970s, the disappearance of almost 30 different young women have been associated with this patch of land, a place which has been described a serial killer's cemetery due to the area's pronounced isolation. Some theorize that multiple serial killers have operated in the area over the years, but only a handful of the murders have been officially connected. Another of these murders is that of 23-year-old Sarah Trusty, who was discovered in the Texas city of Dike on July 28, 2002. Sarah was murdered 4 years before Teresa, and the city of Dike is only 16 miles from the Dickinson High School. It is entirely possible that whoever killed these girls might well be the same person that killed Teresa. But due to time constraints and dwindling evidence, there's only a slim chance her killer will ever meet justice. Perhaps the man still resides in the Dickinson area, biding his time, just waiting for a chance to claim another victim. And when he does, perhaps the Texas killing fields will become the final resting place of yet another innocent young woman. On October 30th of 1975, 15-year-old Martha Moxley and a group of friends participated in what's colloquially known as Mischief Night. Sometimes known as Devil's Night, the night before Halloween sees children and teenagers the world over engaging in all manner of pranks and vandalism. Martha and company chose to hurl full rolls of toilet paper over trees and houses so that long trails of paper were formed. Then, as if to alert the homeowners to their mischief, Martha and her friends would buzz the doorbells before running off into the night. It was innocent, albeit irritating fun. And as the group excitedly walked between potential targets, Martha was spotted talking to an older boy named Thomas Skakel. Later that evening, the pair were spotted swapping kisses and appeared to depart the larger group together at around 9:30 p.m. As she walked away, hand in hand with the object of her affections, Martha's friend believed that they were watching a budding romance. But the truth was, they'd never see Martha again. The next morning, Martha's mother walked out onto the backyard of her home after spotting something lying under a tree. It looked like a pile of clothing at first, but as she got closer, Martha's mother realized what she was looking at. It wasn't some elaborate Halloween decoration. It was the bloodied, beaten body of her own daughter. Not only had Martha been mutilated to the point of almost being unrecognizable, but there were signs that she had been carnally violated prior to her death. Pieces of a broken golf club were lying next to her body. There were signs that Martha's killer had resorted to stabbing her with the sharp end of the broken club once it snapped. After coordinating with a local number of sporting goods stores, law enforcement managed to trace ownership of the gold club to none other than the Skakel family, whose son was one of the last people to see Martha alive. Naturally, this made Thomas a prime suspect, yet suspicion was diverted when his younger brother Michael made a deeply disturbing confession. Michael claimed that around midnight, he'd been window peeping from a vantage point in a tree beside Martha's home. During that time, he claimed to have heard Michael confess to killing Martha with a golf club. Another child testified that Michael was given special privileges due to his family connections and had once been heard to say, "I'm gonna get away with murder." 16 years later, the Moxley family commissioned a private investigator to reopen Martha's case. The investigator's written conclusion came to be known as the Sutton Report, and it revealed the fluid nature of Michael Skakel's ever-changing account, how it morphed from one that implied guilt to one that implied innocence, almost like he was being coached by the family lawyers. The report makes it clear that despite Thomas being the most obvious suspect, it was in fact Michael that was guilty of Martha's murder. It took over a decade of campaigning and investigating, but in June of 1998, Michael Skakel was finally charged with murder, and his bail was set at $500,000. On May 7th of 2002, Skakel's defense attorney told the courtroom that he was an innocent man, and he'd been at his cousin's house at the time of the murder. However, the prosecution was quick to point out that Michael had already admitted to having been hiding in a tree not far from Martha's home, that very same tree under which Martha's body was found. The prosecution argued that Michael had been watching Martha kissing his older brother, then driven by jealousy, had approached her for similar affections once she was alone. The prosecutors then reported that when she rejected him, Michael became so enraged that he attacked Martha with a golf club, beating her to death in the process. Attorneys made such a convincing case that on June 7th of 2002, the jury pronounced Michael Skakel guilty of first-degree murder. And when he was subsequently sentenced to life in prison at the Garner Correctional Institution in Newtown, Connecticut. Following his conviction, Thomas insisted on his innocence, and in 2007, his attorneys officially filed for a new trial. Their bid was centered on a statement given by Tony Bryant, cousin to the departed basketball player Kobe Bryant, and a former classmate of Skakel's. Bryant stated that on the night Martha's murder, one of his friends openly admitted to wanting to attack Martha. The claim was inconsequential, but threw just enough doubt onto Skakel's conviction that his case was brought before the Connecticut Supreme Court in December of 2016. To the Skakel family's boundless disappointment, Michael's murder conviction was upheld by a 4-3 majority, with one judge adding that the conviction was the result of overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecutors. This same judge stated that it was opinion that Michael's legal representation had not been incompetent, and his conviction was the result of his own guilt. Despite his initial conviction, and in 2016 another denial of his appeal, Michael was eventually released from prison, and it was announced that he would not be facing a retrial. Yet several important questions remain. Is Michael Skakel an innocent man who should never see the inside of a prison cell? Or was a murderer content to play a legal long game until he could pervert justice and secure his own freedom? Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, feel free to hit that like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified of future episodes when they come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. All these links are below. Hey everybody, sorry about the long intermission between stories. I was gone all last week in Colorado. I had a really awesome time, got married, no big deal, you know. Had just got a week away, got married and then turned it into like a honeymoon type of thing. Now most of you probably don't give a shit, but that's why I was gone. I bit off a little bit more than I could chew with trying to keep up with the content and the daily shorts, so probably also wondering like, damn, just quit doing all that shit, huh? But I will have this episode you're obviously listening to. I'm gonna have another episode out on Thursday, and then a giant, huge Halloween compilation coming to you on Monday. So either on the 30th or on Halloween day. So you got all that to look forward to. I think the next episode on Thursday is going to be some ghosts and cryptid type of things. So today you get your true crime fix, and then Thursday you'll get that fix, and then on 30th or Sunday, Monday, whatever, you'll get the rest of it. So look out for that, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.